Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. So today, as you might notice, we've got a bit of a different setup. I think this will work better than the old one, and we're reacting to Greek War of Independence, how it started by kings and generals. So this is a little different than the stuff we've reacted to before, but it's not like this channel has a specific focus on, any certain type of history. I'm always willing to react to new stuff. So yeah, I know a bit about the Greek War of Independence. I have a general knowledge of Ottoman history, and as you will see in this video, Greek independence and the Ottoman Empire are very closely tied. I think this is part one of a series, though when I'm recording this, this is the only part that has been released right now, but if they release more parts, I will certainly react to them. So yeah, let's jump right into this reaction.
In Western historiography, the Greek peoples are the proverbial titans of antiquity.
Yep.
Despite this, the modern Greek nation was born in the relatively recent 19th century, forged by revolutionaries who knew only Ottoman domination, and for whom Greece was merely an idea that had to be won in war.
Yeah, and this is actually true for a lot of peoples throughout Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, a country like Greece is a good example because, or a country like Greece, sorry. Greece obviously had a history back to antiquity, and this was true for a lot of these ancient European countries, but it had not existed as a state for a long time. I mean, obviously back in ancient Greece it was a bunch of competing city-states, but they hadn't had independence for a long time, and so this modern Greek nation-state was basically an invention of 19th century modern nationalism that was spurred partially by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And so you'll see this across Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, these modern nationalist movements emerging and creating these modern nation-states that sometimes had never been in existence before. Some of these countries had never had a state of their own, but many of them, such as Greece, were drawing on their own ancient history. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic with the emergence of modern nationalism.
Welcome to our new series on the Greek War of Independence. In this first episode, we will explore the lives of Greek peoples during 500 years of Ottoman rule, before examining the lead-up to revolt and the first stages of the revolution that birthed modern Greece. We've also got a new weapon for you in the fight for online independence, thanks to the sponsor of this video, NordVPN.
Okay guys, you know the drill. I will link their video down in the description. Please go check it out. Please go check out their sponsor. Show some love to the original creators. I believe this is the first Kings and Generals video we're reacting to. I haven't honestly watched a ton of their videos, but the ones I've seen have been fantastic, so please check out their channel, and I will let this ad run.
You probably know about using NordVPN to bypass regional restrictions and encrypt internet activity, but now they offer a new service called Threat Protection that can be used with or without the VPN. It deletes dangerous files that try to automatically download themselves or those hiding behind fake links before any damage can be done. It warns you when a site is potentially unsafe, a phishing scam, or is going to harvest your data, and similarly it blocks web trackers that create data profiles specifically about you, enhancing your anonymity and privacy. Essentially, it rolls the functions of antivirus software into NordVPN, and they remain NordVPN a month for free with
Alright, all good stuff. Go check out their video and their sponsor.
A 2-year NordVPN plan by going to nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. On the 29th of May, 1453, the great bombards of Sultan Mehmed II brought an end to a millennia-old Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire. Henceforth, the overwhelming majority of Greeks were subjects to the sultans of the House of Osman. Under the Ottoman regime...
Yeah, so, as we're seeing on the map, this was the Ottoman conquest of the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Byzantine Empire. Once upon a time, the Byzantine Empire had covered a lot of the area shown on this map. And of course, even further back, the Roman Empire had covered, even more territory. by this point, in the mid 1400s, it was greatly decreased from where it had once been. It basically controlled some Greek territory and the still important city of Constantinople. And after some fighting and conquest, the Ottomans managed to conquer that. And the Eastern Roman Empire was no more. Of course, you still have the Holy Roman Empire, so you could argue that that was sort of the heritage of the Romans still alive. But at least from my perspective, the Eastern Roman Empire had, far more of a direct connection back to the original Romans. It was finally gone, so a pretty monumental event. In many ways, the fall of Constantinople also blocked Western European powers off from often, Arab trade routes coming from the Far East, from Asia, that they'd had access to for centuries. And so they needed to look for new trade routes. Some stuff happens. Eventually that leads basically to the discovery of the Americas by Europeans as they're looking for new trade routes east. So this was an important event is what I'm trying to communicate.
Greeks were grouped into the Rum Millet, a self-governing religious community led by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople.
Yes. So, and this kind of gets into the idea of modern nationalism. At this point, we do not have modern nationalism. People often would not define themselves through a national identity or an ethnic identity. And so when they talk about the Rum Millet, being this Greek community, what that means actually is it's a Greek Orthodox community. So you can see on this map, you'd say, wow, is all that territory in green all Greeks? Well, no, not ethnically. But it's a lot of Greek, those who follow the Greek Orthodox religion. So at this point, this is what is defined as Greeks. And for hundreds of years later, writers would refer to all of these people as Greeks, even though we would not see them as ethnic Greeks. We'd see them as a bunch of different groups, Serbians, Greeks, etc. But this community is defined by religion. That's how the Ottomans defined their different groups. It's a little complicated, and it will be further complicated by the emergence of modern nationalism. But at the moment, the Greek Orthodox religion is a very important part of that identity, more than one's ethnicity.
Which included all other Orthodox Christian ethnicities in the empire.
There you go. That's exactly what I just said.
Despite this, Greek speakers maintained a distinct ethnic identity from their co-religionists, calling themselves Romii, Romans. Indeed, the concept of a Greek or Hellenic...
Yeah, and so this would eventually create some tension with the emergence of modern nationalism, as a lot of the other Greek Orthodox groups, such as Serbs, were like, well, we don't necessarily want to be included with the Greeks because we're something else. And then, as you can see right there, they still call themselves Romans. We think of them as Greeks, and they would come to define themselves as that with the emergence of nationalism. But the Eastern Romans, they spoke Greek, and they had a lot of Greek culture, and they followed the Greek Orthodox Church, but they viewed themselves as Romans, still, even at this point.
Hellenic identity, for the most part, had not existed for centuries, and for early modern Greek speakers, the heroes of Homer were mystical giants from a distant pagan past, not their direct ancestors. For over a millennia, the Greek language had been firmly associated with Byzantine Christianity, so even under the Ottoman Empire, Greeks continued to be identified as Romans.
Yep.
Life for Christians under the Ottoman Empire was complex. On one hand, they were legally an inferior class to Muslims, often subject to arbitrary prohibitions, such as on bearing arms and riding mounts, while their word counted for less than a Muslim's in most courts of law. Additionally, they were beholden to the infamous Deshurma system, in which Christian boys were forcibly taken from their homes and indoctrinated to become the Sultan's loyal slave soldiers. On the other hand, Ottoman Christians had relative religious freedom, while the Ecumenical Patriarchs of Constantinople became highly influential under Ottoman purview. Osmanli overlordship also saw a rise in Greek merchants and landowners. By the 18th century,
Okay, there's a lot of we're covering a lot of history in a very short period of time, which is fair enough because we're getting to the Greek War of Independence. But there's a lot to talk about here. So, in terms of the place of Christians within the Ottoman Empire, it's a complicated one. You know, from our perspectives today, at least I'm speaking from my perspective, I guess, as someone who lives in a liberal Western country, we would see this as very discriminatory, and it was. Non-Muslims were valued less than Muslims, as they mentioned. Their word was not worth as much in court. They were discriminated against. They had to pay extra taxes. But if we look at this in the context of the time, it takes on a bit of a different character. For example, in Spain, around a similar time period, they had the Reconquista, which was where the Catholics pushed out all of the Muslims and Jews, either by murdering them, massacring them, or forcefully pushing them out. So, in comparison, the Ottoman Empire was actually relatively tolerant in that they allowed non-Muslims, particularly Christians and Jews, to live relatively peacefully and govern their own affairs to a certain extent. Now, there were still examples of forced conversion and massacres, but it just was on such a lesser level than in Christian countries. So the Ottoman Empire had a much higher degree of toleration. And then the devshirme system, like they said, was where the Ottomans would take young Christian boys and would indoctrinate them into Islam and would train them to be either troops or civil servants. So this was a system of slavery, which is, horrible. You're taking away someone's bodily autonomy, but at the same time, we do have to look at the complexity of the situation. These boys who were taken would become some of the most powerful men in the empire. They would be, Janissaries. They would be elite troops, and some of them would make it to the highest positions in the civil service. So once again, I mean, this is a terrible, terrible system. But these boys who were taken, and they had a little message in the corner saying that some parents would give up their sons voluntarily because this was a path to success. It could be a path to massive power within the empire. So, yeah, a very, very complex history of Christians and Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And obviously we can't cover even close to all of it here, but it's sort of that's a bit of a summary, I suppose.
A group of Greek merchants, named the Feneriots, had emerged as among the wealthiest magnates in the entire Mediterranean.
And I don't want to talk too much, but just a quick note on that. So yeah, these are the Feneriots, Greek-speaking merchants and civil servants who would sort of create their own communication networks throughout the Mediterranean. And they were basically a very powerful interest group within the Ottoman Empire, and their influence would be particularly important, I'd say a little later on, maybe like 16, 17, 1800s. So yeah, they were an important group.
This even led to the Feneriots being appointed to govern the territories of Moldavia and Wallachia on the Sultan's behalf. All of this might give the impression that Ottoman Greece was a thoroughly tamed land, which it certainly was not. Indeed, while the cities and plains were pacified, the mountains remained a hotbed of native insurgents known as klefts, who generally devoted their lives to banditry against the local Ottoman institutions. In response, the Ottomans hired native collaborators, known as armatili, to root out the klefts. However, loyalties were extremely precarious. Yesterday's armatili could become tomorrow's klefts, and vice versa.
Yeah, so, the modern depiction of klefts can sometimes portray them as like early nationalist heroes trying to fight against the Ottoman yoke. I think that's sort of a very rose-colored idea of them. They're honestly more close to just bandits. Their allegiances would change. The idea of them as these nationalist heroes it's sort of a like modern nationalist invention. There is some truth there, but in my point of view, they are just closer to more, anti-authority bandits. But there is complexity there.
Another group that constantly defied Ottoman authority were the Maniots. Living in unconquerable coastal fortress villages of the titular Mani Peninsula, the Maniots habitually preyed on Ottoman ships, that is, when their many clans weren't engaged in mafia-like blood feuds against one another.
Yeah.
Overall, the Klefts, Armatali, and Maniots were little more than local banditos.
They're saying basically exactly what I said, and as you can see from the note in the corner, they all robbed everyone indiscriminately, regardless of religion or allegiance. So that's what I was getting at. It's sort of inaccurate to view them as these, nationalist ideologues, more banditos, as they said.
However, their existence proved that Ottoman Greece always had people perpetually ready to resist the Ottoman yoke.
Yeah.
But this would only snowball into open rebellion when the time was right. From the 18th century onwards, the Ottoman Empire was increasingly geopolitically contained by the growing global influence of European colonial empires. The most dangerous of these European powers was Imperial Russia.
Yup.
In 1768, Catherine the Great declared one of Russia's many wars on the Turks and emerged victorious, securing favorable terms in the 1774 Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainacha, which included a provision that recognized the Russian Tsars as the symbolic protectors of all Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands.
Yeah, so Russia will be very important to this story, as you will see throughout this video and the series, I suppose. The surrounding powers, particularly Austria and Russia, would continually push the Ottoman Empire's borders inwards, and the Ottoman Empire would shrink continually over the years, particularly through the impact of Russia. Russia would take a lot of territory from the Ottomans, and they would be declared, as was just mentioned, the protector of Orthodox Christians within the empire. Now, obviously, there's an ideological element there. Russia saw itself as the center of Orthodoxy. Moscow was the third Rome. There was Rome, and it collapsed. Then there was Constantinople, and then it was taken over by the Muslims, and then there was Moscow. And, Orthodox Russians viewed Moscow as the third Rome, the center of Orthodox Christianity. So there's an ideological reason for this, but, obviously there's a political reason for this. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the more important reason. This gave Russia, casus belli, a reason to invade the Ottoman Empire basically whenever they wanted. They could point to, real or, frankly, made-up abuses of Ottoman power against Orthodox Christians, and that would give them a reason to invade. And Russia would do this a lot over the next, 100 and, 30, 40, 50 years. This would really allow them to further encroach on Ottoman territory.
Led to increased Russian influence over Ottoman Greeks. Indeed, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, as the great powers of Europe met to decide the fate of their continent after Napoleon's defeat, a young Russian ambassador in the service of Tsar Alexander I proved to be one of the single most influential men in carving out the New World Order. His name was Ioannis Kapodistrias, an ethnic Greek, and while not immediately relevant to our story right now, he will become exceedingly important later, so remember his name. Meanwhile, the Imperial Russian port town of Odessa was home to one of the few thriving Greek communities outside the Ottoman Empire. It was there, in 1814, that the Philiki Aeterea was formed. The Aeterea was a secret society that sought to cultivate a new patriotic ethnogenesis for the modern Greek people by promoting Hellenism, reviving their long dormant ties to the ancient Spartans and Athenians, while doing away with the Roman label which had long become associated with Ottoman servitude.
Yeah, this society would be, would play a role in reviving a Greek identity and creating modern Greek nationalism And this was not unique at the time. We will see societies and groups like this springing up throughout Europe to promote modern nationalism. Ones that I can think of specifically are there were a lot of societies like these in the German states and in Italy. Two examples of, two different ethnic groups, Germans and Italians, who were not unified. And so groups like these would pop up throughout Europe, spreading nationalism following the Napoleonic Wars.
But Veliki Italia was more than just a cultural society, for it was also actively dedicated to the military liberation of their homeland. In 1817, the society propositioned Capodistrias to be their leader, but the great diplomat refused. This gang of radicals, he concluded, would only lead Greece to ruin. Nevertheless, the Etaria soon became a vast Freemason organization with secret supporters all across Ottoman Greece. Agents within the influential Fenerioti merchant class gave the society vast economic and social reach, while initiates among the Klefts and Maniots provided the society with a military backbone. In 1820, Veliki Etaria came under the leadership of one Alexander Ypsilantis, a wealthy aristocrat of Feneriot stock. Immediately, Ypsilantis concluded that now was the time to initiate open revolt.
Yeah, and I think we're about to get into this, but the note in the corner about how Ypsilantis constantly lied to the society about how he had secured Russian backing. He was like, no, the Russians are coming in now to help. They'll definitely be here. And that would be a problem, as I think we're about to get to.
The Ottomans were distracted. The elderly Albanian governor of Epirus was rebelling against the reigning Sultan Mahmud II, who was doubly distracted dealing with escalating border tensions with Persia. Initially, Ypsilantis meticulously drew out detailed war plans, which were to be carefully orchestrated in the spring of 1821. But just after New Year's, a Veliki agent was captured by Ottoman officials while in possession of some compromising documents. Meanwhile, the Feneriot Prince of Wallachia, Michael Zoutsos, had been hedging his bets. While officially a member of the Etaria, he had also secretly sent correspondence to the Sultan informing him of the society's plans. Secrecy was out the window. The revolution had to begin now. Ironically, the first major...
They've got a lot of great information here. So as we can see, one of the issues with Ypsilantis' uprising was that he tried to incite rebellion among other Orthodox ethnic groups like Serbs and Romanians. Romanians in Wallachia, because there was no Romanian state at this point. The issue was that the Romanians didn't necessarily see the Greeks as liberators, because as we mentioned earlier, the Greek Feneriots had been ruling over these territories of Wallachia and Moldavia. They were the ruling class. And so, when a Greek came to these Romanians and said, hey, would you like to rise up on behalf of Greek independence? They said, well, no, you're our oppressors. Why? No, we don't want to rise up with you. That doesn't make any sense. And so there's some, thought that if Ypsilantis had perhaps touched on more of an economic or social agenda, like, hey, let's rise up against, your oppressors, the rich, and make a better society for you, he could have been more successful. But, due to his focus on, this Hellenism and due to the position of the Greek ruling class, Ypsilantis completely failed to gain mass support from other ethnic groups.
Major campaign of the Greek War of Independence began in Romania, for Greek Feneriot ties ran deep there. On February 22, 1821, Ypsilantis crossed the Pruth River into Ottoman Wallachia at the head of a platoon of Greek volunteers he dubbed the Sacred Band, an allusion to the Theban hoplites of antiquity. However, the Wallachian campaign was mired with problems from the start. Ypsilantis continuously motivated his supporters by promising Russian aid, which was never coming, was perpetually short on funds to pay his troops, and had a deeply dysfunctional relationship with the local Romanians.
I mean, you can see how this went so badly. Ypsilantis crosses the river with a small group of men and not that many supplies. But he promises that, one, the Russians are going to send support, definitely, and that, two, the local Romanians will rise up alongside them. For the plan to work, one of these two things, ideally both, would have to have come true, and neither did. So the plan was basically a disaster.
Ultimately, Ypsilantis and his sacred band would be crushed by an Ottoman cavalry force at the Battle of Dragășeni on June 19, 1821.
Yeah.
The Greek revolution had seemingly stumbled out of the gate, but while the northern expedition had failed, rebellious tensions in Greece proper had boiled over. Back on March 25th, at the monastery of Achia Lavra, Feneriots, Archbishop of Patras, raised the Christian banner of revolt, declaring a national uprising. The battle for Greece had begun. In 1821, the Greeks had no regular army. Most revolutionaries had almost no combat experience, as under Ottoman rule, Christians had been largely forbidden to bear arms. Those who were battle-hardened, namely the Maniots, Klefts, and Armatolis, were mostly accustomed to irregular warfare. Moreover, the rebels had little internal cohesion, with different cells of insurrectionists each doing their own thing, without any real central authority to guide them. Nevertheless, a cabal of charismatic commanders ensured that good leadership carried the Greek cause. Be they Maniot sea lords like Petros Mavromichalis, Cleft bandit chiefs like Theodoros Kolokotronis, or Fenariot aristocrats like Demetrios Ypsilantis, the younger brother of Alexander, who was in an Austrian prison. These men of drastically different social class and background led an unlikely band of insurrectionists in the name of a common cause. With that said, revolutionary leaders still clashed with one another as much as they did with the Ottomans over issues of ideology, influence, or shared plunder. Nevertheless, within just a week, virtually the entire Morea fell into Greek hands, save for the cities of Patras and Tripolitsa and some walled fortresses. Control over the Peloponnesian countryside was further secured when a 3,000-strong revolutionary force, under former Cleft bandit lord Theodoros Kolokotronis, defeated an Ottoman force nearly twice its size at the Battle of Veltetsi on May 24th.
So, now we can see how these, basically what we described as bandits are coming into play. For hundreds of years, they've operated in the hills, dealing out guerrilla warfare, but with little allegiance to really any side, just whatever would make them, the most profit, basically. But, we have these organized, armed bands of men who have now been given a cause to fight for. So having these pre-existing bandit groups is actually quite helpful because, as Kings and Generals mentioned, they're sort of one of the few groups of people who have some combat experience and are ready to fight for the cause of Greek independence.
Things were going comparatively worse in central Greece, where the capable Ottoman Albanian general Omar Vrioni won a victory against a promising young revolutionary commander, Athanasios Diakos, who he had executed by impalement. However, Vrioni's army was contained by the heroics of one Odysseus Androutsos, who, while outnumbered 120 to 8,000, defeated the Ottomans at the Battle of Gravia Inn, while losing only 6 of his own men.
Wow.
Ultimately, this allowed the revolutionaries to secure a tenuous hold on central Greece. In 1821, the Ottoman state was ill-prepared to deal with the Greek revolt. For one thing, the imperial army was in the midst of an identity crisis. Former Sultan Selim III had attempted to modernize his forces on a Western European model, but this had gotten him deposed by the Janissaries in 1806, who in the century since their formation had mutated from their original role as an elite corps of loyal slave soldiers into an armed special interests group, scheming against any sultan who threatened their position of privilege.
Yeah. So I'm glad we're talking about the state of the Ottoman Empire at this point. And the role of the Janissaries is in particular a very interesting one. So as was mentioned, they were created by the Devshirme system, so a system of slave soldiers loyal to the Ottoman state. And exactly as the narrator just said, in the time since the Janissaries had been created, they had morphed into something very different, which was basically an elite interest group that was often hereditary. Fathers would pass down their positions to sons, and they, hung around the capital, wielding their influence. You might think of it as sort of like a mob or a mafia group. So this armed, powerful group of individuals who could exert a lot of influence over, the Sultan and Ottoman leadership because, they had the physical power to do so. Sort of like, we've seen similar examples throughout history where, like palace guards or, troops in the capital become particularly powerful due to their proximity to the emperor or the king or whatever, and they're able to exert their own power. This was one of those cases. It's just particularly interesting because, at one point it was literally a corps of slave troops, and now they wield this extreme power in Ottoman politics.
In addition to this, the empire had become increasingly decentralized. Since the 17th century, vast swaths of land had fallen under the control of the Ayans, provincial notables, most of whom acted as de facto autonomous overlords of quasi-independent fiefs. Indeed, when the Greeks raised the banner of revolt, the majority of Ottoman troops had been tied up, putting down the apostasy of Ali Pasha, the 80-year-old Albanian Ayan, to the immediate north. The declining effectiveness of the Ottoman army and the inability of the Sultan to rally his most powerful vassals were both general factors that led to their inability to quell the Greek revolt. While most of the Peloponnese and central Greece was secured, a caste of hardy islanders fought a fierce naval war upon the shimmering seas of the Aegean.
So as we can see, the Ottoman Empire is already not in a great state. It is very much weakened from its position, only, 200 years or so ago. At this point, as was mentioned, the modernization of the military failed. It's experiencing military pressure from all of its neighbors. It rules such a large empire that it really struggles to govern all of it. And many parts of the empire have fallen to these independent local lords, so they can't exert much centralized control anymore. Not to mention, I talked about earlier how when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, European states went looking for different trade routes. So now Constantinople, or Istanbul, it doesn't have the same global prominence that it once did. It's not the center of the world anymore. And so the Ottomans are economically getting left out of the picture as a lot of these European states start to form colonies in the Americas and throughout the rest of the world, and they're getting filthy rich off of it. The Ottomans are not in a position to do the same thing. So the Ottoman Empire is really falling behind in every metric as a lot of European countries get more and more powerful in comparison. Perfect time for a Greek revolution, basically.
In 1821, the Ottoman navy was a juggernaut of modern warships, under the centralized leadership of the Kapitan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Empire. In contrast, the Greeks had only an improvised fleet of lightly armed merchant ships. Nevertheless, they knew the capricious currents of the Aegean better than anyone, so home field advantage was on their side. At the onset of the war, the Greek revolutionary fleet was outfitted principally by merchant shipowners from the islands of Hydra, Spetses, and Sara. Despite lacking in heavy weaponry or centralized leadership, the makeshift Greek flotilla was able to find quick success against the Ottomans. More often than not, the gulf in firepower was overcome through the use of fire ships. On the 27th of May, the Sariot corsair Dimitrios Papanikolis incinerated an Ottoman two-decker frigate off the coast of Eresos, the first of many infernos that would define the Revolutionary War at sea. Greek maritime success was crucial, as it prevented the Ottomans from landing reinforcements in mainland Greece, isolating the remaining imperial garrisons there and contributing to the fall of Ottoman-controlled cities. As the revolt raged on, things got very ugly very quickly. Throughout the empire, Greek civilians were indiscriminately slaughtered, particularly in the capital, where armed Janissaries roamed the streets, killing Christians in cold blood. On April 10th,
Yeah, as was mentioned, the Ottoman Empire of prior years had a pretty high level of tolerance in comparison to its Western neighbors. From this point onwards, like the modern Ottoman Empire would experience a lot of unrest, a lot of ethnic violence, a lot of oppression, a lot of targeted violence, genocidal violence. The Ottoman Empire would fall greatly from its height, and a lot more violence, instability, and intolerance would be introduced. And we're sort of seeing some of that here.
10th, Ecumenical Patriarch Gregory V, the temporal leader of Orthodox Christianity, was suddenly arrested, sentenced to death by the Sultan, and hanged. Ironically, prior to his execution, Gregory had condemned the revolution, and his unceremonious death shocked the Christian world. In Russia, Capodistrias wrote passionate letters condemning the Sultan. But despite this, no aid from Russia or the West came.
Yeah, so this is a very insightful comment, in the bottom right corner as well. Remember the wider context of this. So this is just after the Napoleonic Wars. What happens following the Napoleonic Wars is that, the doctrine of Metternich is put into place throughout Europe. What that means is basically a balance of power. The European countries want to balance power amongst themselves so that they don't have a situation where one of them gets far too powerful compared to the rest, like we had with France and Napoleon. They also want to avoid instability. So, the European powers very much do not want to back a nationalist insurrection. It's fostering instability. It threatens to, unbalance the balance of power in Europe. It's everything they don't want following the years and years of fighting that's just occurred with the Napoleonic Wars. So, and as we will see later, they do get involved. But as of right now, the European powers are really not interested in helping the Greeks out. They just, it does not align with their foreign policy interests.
Meanwhile, revolutionary hands were hardly clean either, and Greek rebels committed numerous exterminations against Muslim civilians. On September 23rd, the city of Tripolitsa fell to the forces of Kolokotronis, and 8,000 Muslim and Jewish civilians within its walls were butchered.
Yeah, and this is also an important point to make. I mentioned how the Ottoman Empire would devolve into ethnic violence, and that's not just on the Ottomans. There was a lot of anti-Muslim violence as well, and a lot of ethnic violence going back and forth. So it truly, the 1800s into the early 1900s for the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire, just a period of a lot of violence and murder. That's an important point that they've just made.
Both Greek and Ottoman forces would continue to perpetrate mass slaughters as the war went on.
Yeah.
In the first year of the rebellion, there was little to no central authority governing the Greeks, as different regions operated under their own independent military leaders and regional governing councils. However, as the permanence of independence set in, it became necessary to establish the proper pillars of government that would define the new Greek nation. In December of 1821, revolutionary leaders of every region of Greece, be they landowners, merchants, intellectuals, warlords, or archpriests, gathered at the town of Piada. The architect of this grand conclave was one Alexandros Mavrokordatos, a young intellectual of aristocratic Feneriot stock. Educated in Switzerland and Italy, and reputedly able to speak 10 languages, Mavrokordatos was a purebred product of the European Enlightenment. As a result, rugged warlords like Kolokotronis hated his guts.
And that's a great point about him being a product of the European Enlightenment. And this brings us back to something I talked about earlier. So, he was, as they said, Feneriot stock. The Feneriots, the powerful class of, government officials and merchants who I mentioned had established trade and communication routes throughout the Mediterranean. What that meant is, with this power, money, communication, they were able to travel. And a lot of them would send their sons to go be educated throughout Europe, oftentimes in Paris. Paris was sort of an important center of Europe. So a lot of these, rich Greeks would go be educated in Paris, and while they were there, they would learn about the tenets of the Enlightenment. They would learn about ancient Greek history, and they would pick up sort of some early nationalism, and they would bring that back to Greece. So this is sort of, this is why, Enlightenment principles and liberal principles that they picked up throughout Europe would be very important to the Greek War of Independence.
To them, Mavrocordatos was little more than a milksop pen pusher, and due to his preference towards Western European clothing, a borderline foreigner. Nevertheless, even the most rough-hewn of clefts saw the necessity of Greek unity, and so gathered at Pieda under Mavrocordatos' auspices. For the next month, various chieftains and regional strongmen quarreled incessantly, but in the end, the contours of nationhood began to form. A national constitution was written, and a provisional government was established, divided into a legislative and executive branch, presiding over 8 federal ministries. Mavrocordatos would, of course, serve as the president of the executive.
I mean, we can obviously see the strong influence taken from the French and American revolutions and constitutions. These were still in recent memory, and they were examples to draw on for the Greek Revolution and many others.
Making him the de facto leader of this new administration. On the 15th of January 1822, the National Assembly of the natal Greek nation collectively signed an official declaration of independence from the Ottoman Empire. The war we are waging against the Turks, far from being founded in demagoguery, seditiousness, or the selfish interest of any one part of the Greek nation, is a national and holy war, the object of which is to reconquer our rights to individual liberty, property, and honor.
I mean, I just mentioned the inspiration taken. If you can't see it there, then you're not going to see it anywhere. Talking about reconquering rights to liberty, property, and honor. This is, one, inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, but also inspired by wider liberal and Enlightenment principles. This is obviously also a very idealized proclamation, as was the American Declaration of Independence, because a lot of the the Greeks who were fighting this war weren't necessarily fighting for these lofty principles, but it's not a bad thing to make your war for independence about. And these, it just sort of shows this Western Enlightenment influence, and it shows the direction that Feneriots and these rich Greeks wanted to take the country in. They wanted to move it in a Western direction, away from the East, away from the Ottoman Empire, towards France, Britain, America. They want to be part of the club. And that will, be a factor in the Greek story ever since, basically.
The dawn of the new year had heralded the dawn of a new nation. The first Hellenic Republic had been born. Despite a new constitution binding them, the rivalries between the Greek revolutionaries would soon stretch to their breaking point, resulting in a series of civil wars at the worst possible time. For, on the other end of the Mediterranean, an invading armada of the invincible governor of Egypt threatened to smother the idea of free Greece in its crib. Our series on the Greek War of Independence will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube.
All right, so shout out to Kings and Generals. That was an interesting video. I think this reaction was particularly long. I talked a lot during this one, but it's because, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire and modern Greece and a lot of topics that we haven't covered yet. So, I've got a lot to say, and that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to speak my mind and tell you my thoughts. But, the further episodes of this series, I will not be as long-winded, because we were giving a lot of context and build-up here. Not to mention that I don't know as much about the rest of the Greek War of Independence. I know a lot about, sort of the early build-up and what led up to it. I enjoyed this one. I hope you guys did. I hope you're liking the new setup. I think it's pretty good. I will say the ring light I have is hurting my eyeballs, but I think it's an improvement from what we had before. If you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the Patreon. I would really appreciate it. I hope all you guys are having a good day, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.